everyone, I'm Andy, the vintage filmmaker. I'm a vintage enthusiast, and I also just so happen to be passionately in love with film. I don't know about you, but I'd like to see a little more vintage in our movies. To that end, I've been working on a little project, and I decided I would finally kind of share that. I've been working in the video production industry for my whole life, and you don't really get to practice a lot of traditional filmmaking as much as we used to anymore. And that's something that as a filmmaker, you kind of hunger for. And as a vintage enthusiast, it's something that I've learned a lot about and really haven't touched since film school. You can read about things and research them to death, but until you really do them, you don't know what it's like. So I wanted to know what it's like. I haven't shot film for myself, certainly. As a history lover, I didn't like the idea that film is kind of relegated to an antiquated past that people are forgetting about. Vintage filmmaking allows me to feel connected directly to history. And that's what I'm about. That's what makes me happy. So this is the first experiment with this. This is a Bell Howell 70D spring-wound mechanical camera. They have no batteries, they have no electronics in them whatsoever, they're completely manual. And for the real camera nerds out there, this is a non-reflex camera, which means you cannot see through the lens. This is how films were shot back in the day. If you've ever tried to take a picture and not seen what your camera is taking pictures of, you don't know if it's in focus, you don't know what the exposure is like. All of this was mechanical. You had to set it before or while you were filming. It's a completely different way of shooting.
Compose the scene carefully in the viewfinder. Set the diaphragm for the right exposure. Always focus the lens to the correct distance.
I first acquired this camera at very little cost. This was an online eBay find that someone posted, had no idea if it worked, and by all accounts, from the photos at least, it looked pretty intact. I thought I will risk this. If at very least, it's something that just screams vintage. So if you want to kind of look up Bell Howell and how they got started, it's a pretty amazing story. But specifically what they're known for is making the first all-metal Hollywood motion picture cameras. Remember, in the early days, movie cameras were made of wood. They were basically wooden boxes. So yeah, as the old story goes, Bell Howell had produced a cinematograph camera, was made of entirely wood and covered with black leather. And the following year, a husband and wife filmmaker team, Martin and Åsa Johnson, discovered that during an exploration trip in Africa where they were to shoot a movie, their Bell Howell camera had been damaged by mildew and termites. So the camera was eaten. So they wrote to Bell Howell, and when Bell Howell learned that their camera had been damaged in this way, they decided that they would try and create the first all-metal professional motion picture camera, introduced in about 1912. And it was called the 2709, and that's a legendary camera. It basically built old Hollywood. You name it, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, pretty much everybody shot on Bell Howell equipment, and that's how they made their name. And after Bell Howell had kind of conquered Hollywood,
this is Ben-Hur, one of the most exciting movies of all time.
Bell Howell began experimenting with the idea of a personal motion picture camera, and they built prototypes, but the company was invited to view Kodak's plans for a 16mm film format. And in 1923, Bell Howell manufactured the first spring-driven 16mm camera, beating Eastman Kodak by about 2 years. The demand for this camera was so great, even at a price of $175, which is today would be about $2,700. It was on back order until 1930. You know, these cameras are great introductory 16mm motion picture cameras, a great introductory camera for filmmakers, simply because they are built like tanks. They are over-engineered to be incredibly reliable. The day that it arrived, I had no idea what was going to be inside. My first reaction upon seeing the leather case, the first thing I saw was all the wear and tear on the bottom of the case, and I thought, uh-oh, this is probably what I'm in for now. It smelled what I can only describe as old. It had that familiar smell of, say, maybe for my musician fans out there, if you ever opened up an old musical instrument case. I used to play trombone, I still have mine, and it smelled almost exactly like that, for what that's worth. Full disclosure, I actually bought a second camera for even less than this one, simply because it was a newer model. It's called a 70DR, and it had a backwind handle mechanism on it that I thought was pretty nifty. It had seen better days. The finish was all gross. That's kind of what I expected most cameras of this era, of this age, to look like. So when I opened up the case and saw this completely immaculate camera, it was completely clean, as though it was built yesterday. I was astonished to see all the goodies that were in there. It had 3 lenses. It had filters for those lenses. It had filter holders for those lenses. It had its original leather strap, which has seen better days, but still, it had just about everything you needed other than film. So then the other thing was, a lot of times with these old finds, whether they're from an estate sale or what have you, the lenses are no good. I gotta be honest, I'm not an expert on these particular lenses. These are what are called C-mount lenses that are very familiar to anybody shooting 16mm format. And I learned during the making of this video that Bell Howell developed the C-mount system for this particular camera. C-mount lenses are actually fairly inexpensive and produce great images. You can find them on eBay, on Amazon, and you can buy really cheap adapters to adapt them to your digital camera, which is exactly what I did because I wanted to see if these lenses were clean and were still producing an image. What you're looking for is stuff like fungus or something growing inside. That'd be bad. And to my utter amazement, they produce a very good, nice image, in fact. And yeah, that got me thinking, will this camera still work? The first thing I tried to do was set the winder. And the winder worked. It ratcheted up. It felt like it was adding tension, and that's exactly what you want. Fun fact with these cameras, you don't wind the winder as so much as you hold the winder still and rotate the camera around the winder. That's actually how they were designed, was to use the momentum in your left hand of the weight of that camera. If it ever looks like, Andy, stop it, you're throwing the camera around all the place, that's why. So yeah, after I was kind of super impressed by the quality of it, I then had to try out the all-important shutter button. And that's where I started to run into issues. I smashed that shutter button down and nothing happened. The camera did not unwind. Did not release the shutter, the gears weren't turning, nothing was working. And that's where I started to go, okay, this is why this was priced where it was. This is a non-functioning camera. Let's research and see if there's a way to get it working. I'd read horror stories of if the spring-wound device is busted, the camera is busted. Nothing in it's gonna work. And I imagined that all the gears in this camera were all seized up. Probably because they weren't lubricated, probably because it was just never used. I had a thought, perhaps there's a way to kickstart this thing. I recreated it here. Sorry, I wasn't filming. It didn't have that backwind handle that you see on it now, which is the hand crank. It's called a backwind crank, but you can use it as just a regular crank and run the camera forwards. So I thought, well, let's start there. Maybe there's a way I could unscrew that backwind mechanism from the one camera and attach it to the other one. And that's exactly what I did. I set the winder in, I went to give it a turn, and it didn't really want to budge, and then all of a sudden, and it went. When it sprung to life, it was just going as fast as it could possibly be. And that's actually not a very good thing for these particular cameras. mainly because they're not designed to run at, kind of full speed without film in the camera. So I tried to lower the frame rate, but there was a problem. The frame rate dial was stuck. And I thought, well, that's not good. So I opened up the camera, kind of tried to diagnose, well, now why won't that work? After kind of working backwards from this little mechanism, I noticed that this seemed to be the part that controlled the frame rate that the dial was connected to. I got some sewing machine oil, which is what's recommended, basically just any kind of mineral oil, and dabbed that in these spots according to the manual. And by using a little bit of cleaner and a little bit of oil, I was able to push that thing free and set the frame rate back. And after rotating the dial some more, I got it working again. So I was so pleased. When it first started turning, it made this really almost adorable kind of creaky sound. You could hear all the little squeaky, 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 squeaky. And it was just a little engine that it could still run. I started to come up with a story for maybe the history of this camera. And it turns out that, after all this time, this thing still runs. The lenses are still good. And I think it's ready to shoot again. An aspect about vintage culture that I love so much is trying to keep memories alive by kind of taking a camera like this and trying to make it live again. You're not just shooting on something like what they had back then. You're actually shooting on what they had back then. For me, that fills me with a lot of joy, knowing that this thing would otherwise be sitting in a closet, or if someone found it and didn't know what to do with it, they would assume it's completely broken and throw it out. I just can't allow that to happen. I want to see what this camera can do. I want to see if it still works. Now, I'm not 100% certain about this. This is an older model camera that uses a specific kind of film called double perf film. It means it has perforations on both sides. So yeah, I got myself some double perforated film. I thought, you know what, I'm gonna start in black and white, because that's where everything started. I haven't touched film since film school, which for me, in my case, was a very long time ago, in 2005. Back in film school, where we loaded some 16mm and some 35mm cameras, they were nothing like this camera. It was a completely different circumstance. But yeah, here's what you would do to practice, of which I did a lot. So the first thing that you do is turn these little clamps. That releases the lid, and now you can set that aside. Try not to get that dirty. So you take out some film, about a foot or two, and you run it through this path through the camera. And it looks a little intimidating at first, but it's not. It's super simple. And if you're kind of good with your hands, which I'm kind of not, you can do this. You're making sure that everything's gripping. And when it's all ready, you push the plate back into place. That clamps everything together. And you make sure that everything's kind of nice and tight and that your loops aren't rubbing on anything. All these sorts of things. This is what's called a daylight spool of film. Now, really quick to my video friends, when we hear the word daylight, we immediately think color temperature. That's not what we're talking about here when it comes to film. This is a daylight spool of black and white film. Huh? That just means you can load this film without the need of complete and total darkness. The thing is though, I was a little paranoid about loading the film because I wasn't sure how dark you needed it to be. They say to load it in dim lighting. I've even heard some people online say, oh, you can load it in the shade of a tree. I didn't know. I don't have a lot of experience with this. So yeah, I basically turned off all my lights. As you can see here, I had to go way up on the gain of my camera so that you could actually see what I was doing in the very, very dim hallway light. And I gotta tell you, it was pretty nerve-wracking. I know it shouldn't be. I know it's not a big deal, but this is me trying to do this on my own and learn a new set of skills that I want to develop. I'm just really worried about opening this up. Oh, this is for real now. Yeah, just a little bit. Ooh. Well, see, now this top loop looks too short. I'm gonna leave it enough of one. At the end, I kind of sealed everything up and breathed a sign of relief. And I think I loaded the film. It's in there for realsies. Whoa. Confidence, no. Yep, that's just how I meant to do that. Right now, that camera there is loaded with black and white film. I'm gonna go see if it works. There's nothing telling me that it shouldn't, but it's just the age of it and what appeared to be the lack of use. Man, I don't know what else could be possibly wrong in there, but I'm going to test the touted reliability of this particular brand of camera and see if this old sucker can still run. That's right, I said sucker. By the time you watch this video, I've probably already shot the film. And then it'll be time to send the film off and get it developed. But staying in line with this kind of the pioneer aspect of filmmaking and how it all started, I decided I'm gonna test it with a little silent movie series. And even though this isn't particularly a silent era camera that would have been used in Hollywood, I feel like if you were an amateur filmmaker in the day trying to make a silent film, this is where you would have started. So in my next episode, you're gonna see exactly what happened. So yeah, I'm just doing this for the love of it. And if you love this kind of stuff, check out my website. It's thevintagefilmmaker.com. Hopefully some fun, interesting stuff there for you that will bring a smile to your day. That's what we're all about here. So yeah, stay tuned for more. If you like this video, if it does something for you, give it a like. And until next time, here's to seeing a little more vintage in our movies. Okay. Hello, I have no idea how to start this. I should have written something down. And this isn't going well. This is me 90% of the time. I have no idea what to say. And I'm just, it must be lunchtime. So I've been, let's keep a little more vintage in our more movies and a bit more, all of it, all the time. So again, guys, I'm Andy, the Vintage Filmmaker, and until next time, let's go eat some lunch.